They say you reap what you sow. For 30 years, I believed that meant if you work the earth with honest hands, water the soil with your sweat, and protect every fragile sprout from the frost, you will harvest a life of quiet dignity. I was wrong. Sometimes you can pour your entire soul into cultivating a sanctuary, only to watch it breed the very parasites that devour you from the root. My name is Clara Higgins. If you drove down Route 9 outside of Ocala, Florida 30 years ago, you would have seen nothing more than 15 acres of choking weeds, a collapsing barn that smelled of damp rot, and a young widow standing in the dirt with two toddlers clinging to her mourning veil. My husband, Thomas, had just been buried beneath a cheap stone after the collapse at the limestone quarry. He left me with a stack of medical bills, a mountain of debt, and a grief so heavy it felt like carrying a wet wool blanket through a swamp. I didn't cry for long. The earth doesn't wait for tears, and neither do hungry children. I traded my mourning dresses for heavy canvas trousers, swapped my silver rings for calloused palms, and turned Hagen's Botanical Nursery from a pipe dream into a reality. It wasn't handed to me. Every single greenhouse panel on that property was hauled by my own back during the blistering summer heat. Every rare Japanese maple and drought-resistant shrub was coaxed to life while my knees sank into cold mud before dawn. People always look at a successful business and see the green canopy, but they never see the rotting roots underneath. My son, Lucas, was 7 when his father died. My daughter, Natalie, was 4. Because their father wasn't there to teach them the weight of a dollar or the ache of honest labor, I overcompensated. I made it my life's mission to ensure they never felt the biting chill of the poverty that nipped at our heels during those early years. If Lucas wanted the expensive branded sneakers to fit in with the boys at the high school, I worked an extra night grafting saplings by lantern light to buy them. If Natalie complained that her college dorm room felt too cramped compared to her roommates, I quietly wired an extra $1,000 to cover her rent upgrade, convincing myself that a mother's job was to flatten every pebble on her children's path. That was my first mistake. I thought I was shielding them from hardship. In reality, I was stripping away their capacity to endure it. I was manufacturing entitlement under the illusion of love, watering a garden of weeds and expecting them to turn into oak trees. By the time Lucas reached 35 and Natalie hit 32, the nursery had expanded, and the suburban sprawl of the county had finally reached our doorstep. Real estate developers were circling our property like crows over a carcass. The land value had skyrocketed into the millions, but while the soil grew more valuable, my children grew more hollow. They stopped coming to the nursery to see their mother. They came only to check the harvest. I remember standing among rows of potted hydrangeas one Tuesday afternoon when Lucas pulled his imported sports car right onto the gravel path, crushing several of my seasonal starter plants without so much as a flinch. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask how my arthritis was flaring up in the damp autumn air. He stepped out, adjusted his designer jacket, and walked straight towards me with that familiar predatory twitch in his jaw, the exact look Thomas used to get when he was about to gamble away grocery money. Though Lucas wasn't gambling on cards, he was gambling on my demise. Mom, stop wasting your time trimming dead leaves. You're sitting on a gold mine. It's time to sign over the property management rights before the county zoning laws shift and we lose millions. I didn't drop my pruning shears. I kept cutting a dead stem, the sharp snip sounding entirely too loud in the quiet afternoon air. I looked up at him, at the manicured hands that had never held a shovel, at the expensive watch bought with the dividends of my sacrifice, and for the first time in 30 years, the blindfold of motherhood slipped entirely off. I didn't yell. I didn't beg him to remember who fed him. I simply looked him in the eye and delivered the only sentence that mattered. You want the harvest, Lucas, but you never planted a single seed. He scoffed, rolling his eyes as if I were a senile old woman reciting nursery rhymes. But that was just the beginning of the drought. The real storm was brewing just over the horizon, and I was about to find out how deep the rot really trent. The drought didn't hit the nursery overnight. It crept in through the ledger books and the shifting tone of voices that used to call me Mama with wet clay on their cheeks. By the time autumn rolled around, Lucas and Natalie had stopped pretending that visits to Higgins' botanical nursery were about family. They didn't come to check on my arthritis or walk among the rows of azaleas. They came with clipboards, zoning maps downloaded from the county website, and an impatience that burned right through their forced smiles. I would catch them whispering near the old packaging shed, thinking the hum of the tractor would drown them out. It never did. That was when the sweet pet names vanished completely from their vocabulary. Behind my back, I wasn't their mother anymore. I was simply the old woman who was standing in the way of their multi-million-dollar inheritance. They talked about me as if I were a stubborn land title holding up a real estate closing, an obstacle to be managed, bypassed, or legally neutralized. The financial pressure escalated week by week. Lucas stopped dropping by unannounced and started making appointments like an impatient executive auditing a failing asset. One Tuesday morning, Lucas walked straight into my potting shed, tracking wet mud across the concrete floor, and slapped a thick manila folder right on top of my pruning tools. Inside was a pre-drafted power of attorney and property transfer agreement, complete with pre-printed signature lines and notary stamps already queued up at a local title company in town. "Sign it, Mom," Lucas said, his tone flat, stripped of even the pretense of warmth. "You're getting older, and dealing with municipal zoning boards, commercial easements, and tax assessments is way too heavy for someone your age. Natalie and I consulted a commercial broker. If we don't lock in the zoning change right now, before the city council revotes on the highway expansion, this land drops in value by half. We're just protecting the family estate, so you don't lose a dime to bureaucratic red tape." I didn't touch the folder. I kept my hands buried in a bag of peat moss, feeling the damp, honest weight of the earth between my fingers. I thought back to just 12 months prior, when Natalie had cried crocodile tears in this very shed, begging for capital to bail out her failing boutique downtown. I had liquidated $50,000 of my personal retirement savings, money meant for my final quiet years, and handed it to her without a single contract. I did the exact same thing for Lucas when his landscaping venture went belly up after he bought too many luxury trucks. I looked up at my son, whose designer jacket cost more than my first 2 commercial greenhouses combined. "You talk about protecting the estate, Lucas, but last year I gave both you and your sister $50,000 of my retirement money to keep your businesses afloat, and neither of you has paid back a single cent," I said, my voice as steady and cold as winter ground. "This land isn't a corporate asset waiting for a buyout. It's 30 years of my sweat, and I am not signing away my life's work to children who only know how to empty accounts, not fill them." The transformation was instantaneous. The thin mask of filial piety melted away entirely, leaving behind the ugly, entitled raw nerve of greed. Lucas's face flushed a dark, angry crimson, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The polite executive facade vanished, replaced by the posture of a creditor shaking down a deadbeat debtor. Natalie, who had been waiting by the doorway with her arms crossed, stepped inside and let out a sharp, cynical laugh that cut through the hum of the greenhouse fans. "Are you serious right now?" Natalie snapped, her voice rising with a shrill, venomous edge. "You think you built this place all by yourself? We wasted our childhoods out here hauling dirt while our friends were on vacations, and now that we actually need to secure our futures, you're acting like a selfish tyrant hoarding a pile of dirt you can't even take with you to the grave."
They didn't see a mother standing across that workbench. They saw a malfunctioning ATM machine that refused to dispense cash. They argued for an hour, cycling through desperate begging, guilt trips about my age, and finally open, naked hostility. They demanded, they threatened, and when I remained completely immovable, they stormed out of the shed, slamming the heavy wooden door so hard that several clay pots rattled off the top shelf and shattered on the floor. I didn't bend down to sweep up the broken pottery right away. I just stood there in the quiet gloom of the greenhouse, watching the dust motes dance in the slanting afternoon light. The roots had been choked out for a long time. Now the weeds were showing their true thorns.
The final shadows of a late autumn Tuesday stretched long across the acreage when the heavy delivery trucks pulled out and the last seasonal worker packed his tools into his pickup and drove down the gravel lane. The nursery was quiet, swallowed by the settling dusk and the rustle of dry leaves caught in the evening wind. I stayed behind in the main packing shed, auditing the ledger and making sure the digital security code on the office safe had been successfully updated after my children's aggressive stunt with the transfer papers earlier that week. They didn't wait long to test the new locks. Within an hour, headlights flashed fiercely against the translucent corrugated fiberglass walls of the shed. The engine of Lucas's sports car roared, cutting out abruptly with a screech of brakes right outside the heavy double doors. The locks clicked open with a violent rattle, and both Lucas and Natalie forced their way inside, bringing with them a sharp chemical scent of alcohol and prescription stimulants, mixed with the raw, volatile stench of unbridled rage. Their eyes were red-shot, their movements jittery and erratic. They had discovered that the safe combination was changed, and the realization that their mother had outsmarted them had pushed their entitlement over the edge into sheer madness. They didn't bother pretending to be respectful children anymore. Lucas marched straight toward me, his face twisted in a snarl, demanding the new combination codes for both the safe and the digital banking accounts. When I turned my back to them and continued packing my files into a metal drawer, refusing to acknowledge their hysterics, the situation snapped beyond repair. The physical violence started not with a premeditated plan, but with the impulsive brutality of spoiled children denied a toy. Lucas lunged forward, grabbing the leather strap of my purse hanging over my chair, violently ripping it away to search for spare keys and physical tokens. When I instinctively reached out to block him, trying to pull my belongings back, he threw his full weight into a vicious shove, pushing me backward with both hands, straight into a towering stack of heavy, imported terracotta pots resting on wooden pallets. The impact was deafening in the enclosed shed. Earthenware shattered into 100 fragments as I crashed hard against the jagged rim of a massive planter before hitting the concrete floor. The air was sucked entirely out of my lungs in a single agonizing gasp. In that split second of silence, before the ringing in my ears took over, I heard a sickening, dry crack echo inside my chest. A sharp, piercing snap as my fifth and sixth ribs splintered under the crushing weight of the fall. Pain flared through my torso like white-hot iron, paralyzing my diaphragm and making every desperate attempt to draw breath feel like swallowing crushed glass. I lay crumpled among the shards of clay and spilled potting soil, clutching my chest, unable to speak, my vision blurring at the edges as darkness threatened to pull me under, wondering how 40 years of endless sacrifice had culminated in this cold, dusty floor. In any normal family, the sight of an aging mother collapsing, gasping for air, and clutching a broken rib cage would provoke immediate panic, remorse, or a frantic call for an ambulance. But blood had long since turned to ice in my children's veins. Instead of kneeling down to check if I was breathing, instead of calling 911, Lucas slammed his boot against the concrete floor in a childish tantrum of frustration.
He leaned over my paralyzed body, his face flushed with vicious anger, and spat out the words that shattered whatever maternal illusion I had left. "You fell yourself, old woman. We didn't touch you. Don't try to pull some pathetic stunt just to scare us into handing over the property deed." Natalie didn't flinch either. She stepped right over my legs, ignoring my agonizing gasps for air, and immediately knelt beside my scattered purse. With cold, practiced precision, she unzipped the side pockets, fished out my spare house keys and my wallet, and began rifling through the compartments, looking for safety deposit box tokens. They treated my physical agony not as a medical emergency, but as a minor inconvenience in their pursuit of cash, stepping around my trembling body as if I were nothing more than an old piece of furniture they had knocked over in the dark. As they finally stormed out of the shed, clutching my stolen keys and slamming the heavy door behind them into the gathering night, the physical pain in my chest was nothing compared to the absolute, hollow coldness settling over my heart. The roots had not just rotted, they had completely severed. They wanted a war of survival, and tonight they finally forced me to seal their fate permanently.
The heavy wooden door slammed shut, echoing like a sharp gunshot through the empty packaging shed and leaving behind a deafening silence. The sound of tires grinding harshly over the gravel lane slowly faded into the damp autumn distance, leaving me alone with the rhythmic drip of a leaking watering hose and the suffocating pressure trapped inside my chest. Every single breath felt like inhaling jagged shards of broken glass as I lay crumpled awkwardly on the cold concrete floor. Staring up at the dark shadows stretching across the wooden rafters, I knew with absolute certainty that if I didn't force myself to move right now, I might never get up again. I had to survive this terrifying night, not to beg for their worthless mercy, but to ensure that the enterprise I built with my own bare hands would never become the ultimate reward for their unbridled cruelty. With my vision blurring at the edges and my right side burning with white-hot agony, I forced myself to crawl across the dusty floor toward the office desk, my fingers stained with dark soil and trembling from intense shock, finally hooked onto the edge of the heavy oak base. Pulling myself up with a silent, agonizing cry of pain that tore through my throat, I reached the landline phone and punched 911. They had taken my personal purse when they ransacked the room looking for keys, but they completely missed the emergency line wired directly into the back office wall, giving me the lifeline I desperately needed to fight back against their assault. The county hospital ER was a sterile, glaring blur of harsh fluorescent lights, cold stethoscopes, and hurried nurse footsteps shifting through the night shift. The county doctor shined a penlight into my eyes before reviewing the digital x-rays on the wall, confirming what my body already screamed out: fractured fifth and right sixth ribs, accompanied by severe deep tissue contusions from blunt force trauma. Within an hour of my admission, 2 local sheriff deputies walked into my curtained hospital cubicle to take an official statement. They asked direct questions about how an older woman sustained such specific, severe injuries inside her own business after dark. Before I could answer their report, my cell phone buzzed violently on the bedside tray, lighting up the dark room with an incoming call alert. It was Lucas, checking to see if I was still breathing or if I had dared to talk to the authorities. I hit speakerphone while the deputies stood close by, their notebooks open and their eyes locked on the glowing screen. Lucas's voice blared through the small speaker, stripped of any family pretense, dripping with raw, calculated intimidation. "Listen to me, Mom," he barked, his tone sharp and commanding, showing absolute zero remorse for what his hands had done to me just hours before. "You tell those cops you slipped on a wet patch of mud near the greenhouse and fell into the pottery racks by accident. If you breathe a single word about us being there or what happened,
Don't expect us to ever visit you again, and don't expect a single person to care about an old woman living alone out in the sticks." The deputies exchanged heavy, knowing glances. They had seen this kind of psychological coercion from ungrateful relatives 100 times before in this county. They waited for my tears, my public outburst, or a desperate plea for police protection to lock my biological children away immediately behind bars. Instead, there was absolute silence in the hospital cubicle, broken only by the steady mechanical beep of the hospital monitor. I looked past the deputies at the blank hospital wall, feeling something deep inside me finally turn completely to stone. The 40 years of maternal guilt, the constant urge to protect and excuse them, evaporated into thin air. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I didn't argue with my son over the phone. I let a chilling, artificial calm wash entirely over my voice, matching his cold manipulation with a quiet assurance that would seal his ultimate doom. "All right, Lucas," I said, my voice completely steady, devoid of any warmth or anger. "Stop worrying. Come back to the house this weekend, and I'll sign over everything you've been asking for." On the other end of the line, Lucas let out a sharp, victorious laugh, completely blind to the legal trap he had just walked straight into. Hearing his mother surrender so easily made him believe he had won total and absolute control over my life's work. He hung up immediately to celebrate his victory with his sister, completely unaware that the silence on my end wasn't submission. It was the sound of a legal trap locking permanently shut behind him, setting the stage for what was about to unfold at the lawyer's office next week. I spent the rest of the night reviewing the hidden safety documents in my mind, knowing their greed had finally provided the exact noose they needed to hang themselves.
The autumn air on that Monday morning carried a sharp, biting chill that seemed to match the frozen calculation locked deep inside my mind. By 10 o'clock, the frosted glass door of Miller and Associates law firm swung open with a crisp chime, and my children swept inside as if they were walking down a grand red carpet to claim a newly conquered kingdom. Lucas strode in first, wearing an expensive wool coat and a smirk that barely contained his smug euphoria, while Natalie trailed right behind, carrying a chilled bottle of imported champagne wrapped neatly in a silver foil sleeve. They didn't look like grieving relatives visiting an injured mother recovering from a severe hospital admission. They looked like absolute conquerors, arriving to divide up the spoils of a fallen empire they never worked a single day to build. Attorney Miller, who had served as our family legal counsel for over 30 years and had watched my children grow from helpless toddlers into deeply entitled strangers, looked up from his heavy mahogany desk with an expression of profound, quiet exhaustion. He didn't offer them coffee, nor did he congratulate them on their festive mood. He simply gestured toward the two empty leather chairs positioned directly across from his desk, right where the sharp morning sun cut a glaring line across the room. I was already sitting quietly in the corner seat, my posture rigid to suppress the dull, persistent throb radiating from my fractured ribs beneath a heavy wool sweater and a concealed medical compression wrap. Every single movement required a conscious, agonizing effort, but my eyes were clear, steady, and sharp as broken glass. "Well, Miller, looks like the old lady finally saw reason after all," Lucas announced loudly, dropping his car keys onto the polished wood with an arrogant clatter as he sank into the leather chair.
Natalie popped the cork of the champagne bottle right there in the quiet law office, letting out a sharp, echoing snap that made the paralegal outside flinch, before pouring 2 small glasses of sparkling wine to toast their impending multi-million-dollar windfall. We told you patience was a virtue, didn't we? Let's just sign the paperwork, get the property deed transferred to our joint LLC, and finish what we started, so we can list the nursery before the municipal zoning committee closes the window. I didn't utter a single word in response to their gloating. I reached into the structured leather tote bag resting beside my chair, pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder tied securely with a red cotton string, and slid it across the broad expanse of the desk toward Attorney Miller. The folder landed with a dense, authoritative thud that instantly cut through their celebratory giggles. Here are the finalized legal instruments you requested, Miller, including the comprehensive asset restructuring rider and the updated beneficiary clauses we reviewed last night, I said, my voice completely level, carrying a chilling artificial warmth that made Natalie's champagne glass pause halfway to her lips. Before Miller could even open the clasp or adjust his glasses, Lucas lunged forward with predatory eagerness. He snatched the thick folder off the desk, his hands shaking slightly with greed as he ripped open the flap. To my children, the thick stack of papers represented the ultimate key to the $4.5 million commercial valuation tied to the new highway expansion project. They were completely blinded by the blinding prospect of instant wealth, utterly convinced that their weekend intimidation tactics had successfully broken my stubborn will. Finally, Natalie whispered, leaning over her brother's shoulder, her eyes wide and glittering with unbridled excitement as she scanned the top sheets covered in complex legal jargon. $4.5 million, free and clear, just like we planned all along. Lucas wasted no seconds reviewing the complex financial disclosures, the detailed historical annexes, or the small print restrictive covenants tucked away in the middle pages. He didn't care about easements, tax histories, or zoning restrictions anymore. His eyes were entirely fixed on the final signature page at the very back of the document. He pulled the pages rapidly, his thumb sliding over clause after clause of dense legal text without reading a single sentence of the binding conditions we had spent all weekend drafting in secret. He pulled a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from his breast pocket, unscrewed the cap with a sharp click, and slammed the final page down flat on the desk, right in front of his sister. Sign the transfer line, Natalie, right here under the primary executor slot, and then hand it over to me so we can lock this down permanently, Lucas instructed, his voice trembling with manic excitement as he pushed the pen into her hand. We won. The entire estate is finally ours. As Natalie reached out with an eager hand to clutch the pen, Miller slowly lowered his glasses, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet, knowing gravity. I let the heavy silence stretch across the room, watching them step blindly into the abyss they had dug for themselves. The sudden scratching sound of the pen tip stopping against the heavy parchment was the only noise left in the quiet room. Natalie kept her hand resting over her signature, her eyes lingering on the neat cursive letters she had just written with such eager, unearned confidence. She looked up at Mr. Miller, expecting him to slide the execution copy across the mahogany table so her brother could finalize the transfer of our family's entire estate. Instead, the elderly lawyer did not reach for his gold stamp. He calmly removed his half-moon spectacles, folded them with a deliberate click, and laid them beside the thick dossier. Before we proceed with any further execution, it is my professional duty as the senior counsel of record to read aloud the binding operational clauses contained in Section 9, subsection B, which was duly notarized and registered at the county courthouse exactly 24 hours ago. Mr. Miller's voice cut through the heavy silence with a dry, unyielding authority that made the expensive champagne glasses on the side table seem entirely out of place. I sat quietly in my corner seat, my hands folded calmly over my lap, watching the transformation begin right before our eyes. Mr. Miller opened the document to a flagged page and began to read with deliberate slowness, letting every single syllable sink into the suddenly frozen room. He did not read about property deeds, land transfers, or joint commercial LLCs for the nursery expansion. Instead, the words echoing off the polished walls spoke of an irrevocable trust and a strict disinheritance clause, a legal fortress designed to protect the enterprise from unbridled corporate greed and familial sabotage. Every single acre of the 15-acre nursery ground, along with the $1.2 million in liquid cash reserves, had been permanently transferred into a community conservation trust managed by an independent board of environmental trustees, leaving my children with zero legal claim to any part of the estate. Natalie's smile evaporated instantly, the color draining from her face as if a physical blow had struck her chest. She snatched the top pages back toward her, her eyes frantically scanning the dense paragraphs she had neglected to read just moments before. "What is this?" Natalie gasped, her voice cracking into a shrill, panicked whisper as her fingers traced the legal terminology. "Where's the direct deed transfer? This says we get nothing, absolutely nothing." Lucas lunged forward so violently that his heavy leather chair tipped over backward, crashing against the oak paneling with a deafening bang. His face flushed a deep, violent crimson, distorting his features into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He slammed his fists down onto the mahogany surface, making the champagne bottle rattle dangerously against the wood. "You old witch!" Lucas roared, his voice losing any remaining pretense of civility as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, spitting with rage. I didn't flinch, and I didn't raise my voice to match his unhinged shouting. I simply looked up at my son, letting the cold reality of his own destruction wash over him. "I didn't trick you, Lucas," I said softly, every word dripping with a lethal, icy calm. "You simply forgot to read the terms before signing away your entitlement." Blinded by sheer panic and absolute rage, Lucas reached across the table, his fingers clawing wildly at the heavy stack of papers, trying to rip the binding apart to destroy the legal proof of his failure. But before his hands could touch the portfolio, the heavy oak office door swung wide open with a sharp click. Two large, uniformed private security officers stepped into the room, their expressions completely professional and immovable. Without a single wasted word, one of them firmly gripped Lucas by the shoulder, pulling him back from the desk with effortless authority, while the second officer placed a transparent plastic evidence bag gently down on the polished wood beside the disputed trust documents. Inside that clear bag lay a certified copy of the county hospital's trauma X-ray report, confirming my fractured ribs, right next to a small digital audio recorder. With a slow, deliberate motion, Mr. Miller pressed play on the device. Within a fraction of a second, Lucas's own voice, harsh, threatening, and dripping with intimidation, echoed loudly through the quiet law office, ordering his mother to lie to the police about her hospital visit to cover up his assault. Lucas froze, the remaining color draining entirely from his face as he stared at the recorder, realizing with terrifying clarity that the legal trap had finally snapped shut for good. My children had come here to claim their victory. only to walk straight into a lifetime of accountability.
The autumn air inside that glass-walled conference room felt heavy, suffocatingly cold as the full legal reality finally settled over us. Attorney Vance did not raise his voice, but every single word he spoke carried the crushing weight of judicial finality. He laid out the documented medical reports detailing my fractured ribs from the night of the attack, matching them directly with the hidden security footage capturing their threats and the physical coercion used to force my hand on the property transfer papers. It was no longer a messy family disagreement to be smoothed over behind closed doors. It crossed a very hard, very clear legal boundary into severe elder abuse and felony fraud. The district attorney's office had already reviewed the certified evidentiary packets, and the legal machinery of the state was now fully in motion across the county. Before either of my children could fully process the gravity of what was happening, the heavy oak door of the conference room clicked open. Two uniformed police officers stepped inside, their presence instantly draining whatever fragile illusion of control my children had desperately clung to all morning. The metallic glint of the handcuffs clipped to their utility belts caught the harsh fluorescent light overhead, signaling that the safety net they thought protected them from accountability had finally dissolved completely into nothingness. Natalie broke first, her arrogant defiance shattering into raw, unfiltered panic. All of the sneering remarks about how I was a burdensome old woman who should have signed everything away years ago vanished in a fraction of a second. She dropped hard to her knees against the polished floorboards, her designer handbag spilling its contents across the rug. She scrambled forward on all fours, her fingers clawing desperately at the hem of my wool coat, sobbing hysterically as she begged me to call off the authorities. "Mom, please, please withdraw the complaint," she choked out, her voice cracking with ragged, desperate panic. "You can't do this to us. Just give us enough to clear the commercial bank debts, just enough to pay off the mortgage on the nursery properties. We are your children. Please, Mom, save us from prison." Beside her, Mark stood completely paralyzed, his face drained of every ounce of color, his lips trembling as he stared at the officers, taking a measured step closer. He looked less like a grown businessman and more like a terrified child caught doing something unforgivable, finally realizing that no amount of shouting or intimidation was going to rescue him this time. The banks were calling, the foreclosure notices were piling up on their desks, and the trap they had so carefully laid for me had finally snapped shut on their own ankles. I did not flinch, and I did not pull my coat away from her clutching fingers. I simply stood up, smoothing the fabric of my skirt and deliberately buttoning the top button of my jacket with steady, unhurried fingers to hide the medical brace beneath. I looked straight down into the eyes of the two people I had spent my entire life protecting, nurturing, and sacrificing for, only to watch unbridled greed completely hollow them out from the inside. I didn't yell, I didn't lecture them with a long list of historical grievances, or shed a single tear. At that moment, grief had already burned itself out, leaving behind a profound, unshakable clarity. I looked right at Natalie, who was still weeping on the floor, and delivered the only words that needed to be said. I spent 30 years planting, watering, and protecting this family's nursery, but I made the fatal mistake of forgetting to prune out the destructive parasites. Today, let the law and the real world finally teach you both the true value of independence.
With that, I turned my back, picked up my structured leather bag, and walked past the officers toward the open exit. Behind me, the heavy steel cuffs clicked into place, signaling the end of a chapter I never wanted to write, and the beginning of a hard-earned peace. Looking back on it all from my quiet front porch now, I realize that love without boundaries is nothing more than an open invitation for destruction. The nursery grounds across the valley are blooming under the careful care of the community trust, entirely free of greed. My ribs still ache on damp mornings, serving as a permanent reminder of the price I paid to wake up. But the weight in my chest is gone forever. Let this be a reminder to anyone listening tonight. Never let entitlement blind you to the dignity of the person who gave you life, because when the final ledger closes, everyone must answer for what they built or destroyed.
6 months have passed since the legal storm finally cleared, and the quiet rhythm of the new harvest has settled over the land. The court case is officially closed. Lucas received a just and unyielding sentence, followed by years of strict probation that ensure he can never again manipulate or exploit anyone's labor and trust. The Higgins plant nursery, once a suffocating cage built on deception and quiet extortion, has been completely transformed. It is now a public biological research center, buzzing with students, researchers, and green-thumbed locals who treat the earth with respect rather than greed. I sat this morning on the old wooden bench right in the middle of the garden. The air around me is alive with the brilliant, unapologetic yellow of sprawling sunflowers and the sharp, clean scent of young seedlings breaking through the soil. For the first time in what feels like an eternity, I lifted a warm ceramic cup of herbal tea to my lips and took a sip, breathing in deeply. There's no phantom weight on my chest, no sudden tightening in my throat, and no lingering shadow of fear or manipulation whispering that the other shoe is about to drop. The silence here isn't lonely anymore. It is simply free. I still remember the last time Lucas stood before me, back when the investigation was closing in and his mask of false entitlement finally began to slip. He looked at me with that familiar, desperate flicker of arrogance, demanding to know how I could throw away everything we had built. "You are destroying our family over some dirt and paper," he had spat, his voice sharp with a lifetime of avoiding consequences. I didn't yell. I didn't break. I just looked straight into the eyes of a man who had never learned how to exist without consuming others, and gave him the only truth that mattered. I am not destroying a family, Lucas. I am finally letting the earth heal what you tried to rot. He had no answer to that. The silence that followed was the final fracture in his armor. Now, sitting here beneath the open sky, the past feels distant, like a storm that has spent its last drop of rain. I leaned forward slowly and reached down to the rich, damp earth. My fingers brushed against a handful of newly gathered seeds, searching until I found one that was heavy, whole, and undeniably alive. I held it in my palm for a quiet second, feeling its quiet potential before pressing a gentle smile to my lips. I placed the seed down into the dark, fertile soil, covering it with just enough earth to let it find its own way toward the light. True love is never about wrapping a child in velvet cushions to protect them from the world, only to suffocate and kill their soul in the process. Real love is teaching them to stand firmly on their own 2 feet, to weather the storms, and to grow strong enough to face the sun by themselves.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below, so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.